times when I am aware that I'm not always completely honest with those around me. Such a time occurred this morning already once in your presence when I told the children that we have an entire year before us that is a blank calendar. Y'all know that's not true, right? That there are some things that are already on the calendar for 2012. One of the things that started in 2011 and will continue until November of this year is a lot of time spent in politicking. Y'all know, I mean, that's a done deal, folks. It's on the calendar. It's going to happen. Every day, you and I are going to listen to everything in the media about everybody that's running for every office that it was ever created. And there's no way we can escape that. On the calendar for this year already are days, lots of days, when folks like you and I are going to be faced with the difficulties and the problems of life. Now, we may not know what day they're going to occur yet, but we know that they're there. We know that there are days when we're going to wake up in despair, feeling hopeless. There are days when we're going to wake up and it's a beautiful morning and all of a sudden in the middle of the day we get a bad news about a friend, a relative, about ourselves. The calendar is already quickly filling up. We know that already in 2012 there are all too many days where already written on that day is a notation that on this day X numbers of millions of people in the world woke up hungry or homeless. We know that there are already too many days in 2012 written on that calendar when if we could read ahead of time what it would say is, on this day, so many of God's children died in acts of war and violence. It's not a really good way to start the new year, is it? To remind ourselves that the calendar is already beginning to fill up. Now, here's what I think. I think that the Church of Jesus Christ exists on this earth precisely to take that calendar with that word, those words already written on it for a new year, and speak an alternate voice in the world that begins to address those issues and do something about them. I don't think we're the people who are called to sit back and say, that's just the way life is, that's the way it's been for thousands of years, and there's nothing we can do about it. And I suspect that God expects no less of us than to be a people who take that calendar of 2012 with all of that stuff written on it and said, now is the time you begin to address it. One of the things that I know is that even in the Old Testament, our God was a God who was about addressing those kinds of issues. In the 5th chapter of Amos, in the 24th verse, the prophet records these words, "But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." I don't know whether you've made any New Year's resolutions yet. I haven't, and the reason is that every New Year's resolution I make, I break. I've never held one yet that lasted past about the 15th of January, I think. But I think this year I'm not going to make any New Year's resolutions. Instead, I'm going to try to make a New Year's promise. That at least for me this year, and hopefully for the church, our promise is that we will take seriously that God invites us to be the people going into a new year who affirm that justice ought to be rolling down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. We ought to be partnering with God to make sure that that happens. Now, one of the intriguing things, of course, is that if you listen closely to the words from the psalmist this morning. He talks about righteousness and he talks about justice, and he equates them with precisely many of the problems that we have in the world. He focuses on, in talking about righteousness and justice, the poor and the marginalized and the hungry. He says, you will know that justice is rolling down like waters and righteousness like a living stream when those issues begin to be addressed and not just talked about, but that inroads begin to be made so that those issues are no longer issues which dominate our dialogue and our days, but instead are issues that we as a church have begun to address. One of the amazing things is that Paul in his letter to the church at Ephesus says basically the same thing, but he talks about it in terms of Christ. Remember what he says? He says he's a prisoner for Christ, and this is the nature of his imprisonment. He is imprisoned by God's call and claim on his life to be the one who proclaims the mystery of Christ. And one of the amazing things about that is that if we took a vote among Christians about what the mystery of Christ is, we'd come up with all kinds of answers. But Paul only defines it one way in all of his writings. He says, this is the mystery of Christ, that Christ came so that the Gentiles might be made fellow heirs with the Jews of the blessings of God. Now understand that when Paul wrote those words, there were really two divisions in the world. There were the Jews and there was everybody else, the Gentiles. Those folks that from the perspective of the chosen people of God were the marginalized, the folks on the outside, the folks that need to be invited in. So when Paul talks about proclaiming the mystery of Christ, what he's really saying is, folks, the mystery of Christ is that all of a sudden we all become one. That there are no outsiders. There are none that are marginalized. There is not us and them. There is only us. The entire people of God, everyone who God has breathed life into in this earth. It's an amazing concept. And maybe Paul uses the right word when he talks about the mystery of Christ, because quite frankly, in my humanness, I have a really difficult time imagining that as a possibility. Imagining that there will come a time when we are all one in this one God that we worship together. I have a tough time ever getting to the point in my mind where I can see a world where there aren't some on the inside and some on the outside. I have a tough time imagining the power of God that will create a world where there are no longer haves and have-nots, but there are only those who share together. Maybe Paul had it right when he called that the mystery of Christ, because in our humanness we cannot understand that ever being a possibility. We know each other too well, and we've lived in this world too long. But Paul does not present that as a hopeless impossibility, but says he comes as a prisoner of Christ to proclaim the mystery of Christ, which is that there are no more divisions in this world between the haves and the have-nots, the ins and the outs, that somehow we are all one. Now here's the other thing that Paul says, and it's in the next 6 verses that Mary didn't read. If you've got time this afternoon, grab a Bible and read verses 7 through 12 of that 3rd chapter of Ephesians. Because this is where it gets interesting. Paul talks about proclaiming the mystery of Christ, and Paul says his task is to bring to light the mystery. In other words, his task is in the midst of the darkness to reveal that mystery to the world, so that we all kind of get on the same page about what it is that God wants, about what God means when he encourages Amos to talk about justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. If we are called, like Paul, to be prisoners for Christ, then we, like Paul, are called to bring light to the mystery. And of course, that assumes that there is, in this world, dark places where the mystery needs to be brought to light. I suggest that not all of those dark places are outside the walls of Christ's church. That sometimes that darkness exists precisely within the community of faith that closes its eyes to the reality that there are all too many people in the world that are marginalized. There are all too many people in the world who are on the outside looking in. There are all too many people in the world who look at the days of the calendar that we begin to fill out, who are poor, who are hungry, who are the recipients of violence and war and hatred and oppression. There are all too many people whose lives are broken by despair. There are all too many people whose lives are broken by physical or emotional or spiritual ailments. There's all too much darkness in the world out there. And if we as the church going into the new year fail to recognize the darkness, then it's tough for us to believe that we, like Paul, are called to be prisoners of Christ and to bring to light the mystery of the faith. That God's desire for this year, for this church, and for the church universal is that we take seriously that we are called to partner with God, that justice would roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So between now and the 1st of Lent, that's what we're going to talk about. We are going to, between now and the 1st of Lent, look at the different pieces of the puzzle that might impact that call of God in our lives and indeed might make that possible. We won't deal with all the pieces, but hopefully we'll deal with enough that we begin to get a picture. And the first piece is the recognition of the darkness. One of the things I'm always intrigued about in the story of the Magi in the 2nd chapter of Matthew is that it starts with these Magi. We don't know how many for sure. The Bible doesn't tell us. Tradition says 3. Saw a light in the east. And it was that light that led them to the Christ, to the one who would bring people and bind people together in the covenant relationship with one God. Did you ever stop and think about this? Because the story goes on for 11 verses, and it's all about Herod and what he tells them and what they do and what they don't do. I want you to think about this for a minute. The only way they could have seen that star was in the darkness. I challenge any of you to walk out of this church right now and look up and point to a star, with the exception of the sun, of course. The reality was that the light was made known in the darkness. And one of the things you see that we seem to forget is that it is in the darkness, in the dark of the night, that the light is revealed. And if we as a community of faith and as individual Christians, if the universal church is not willing to live in the darkness with people, to recognize that it's a reality and commit to doing something about it, then we'll never see the light. Isn't that an amazing thing? That to see the light of the star that led them to the manger, they had to be willing to live in the darkness. So, I guess my hope, and my prayer at least for myself for this year as we move forward, is that somehow I find the courage and the strength to promise, not to resolve, but to promise God that I'm going to be part of that group of people who is willing to live in the darkness so that I can proclaim the mystery of Christ. That I become one of those people who's willing to take that light into the darkness. So that somehow or another, by the time we get to December 31st of 2012, 366 days from now, that we're just a little bit closer to realizing the vision that God has for God's world. Of all of God's people, regardless of gender or race or religion, that all of God's people might be one. That happens as we take seriously that it's up to us to proclaim and live into the words of Amos. That justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Now the amazing thing is, if you go back to the Psalms, and the 72nd Psalm that kicks all of this up in its talk about righteousness and justice and the focus on the poor and the marginalized. If you read those words closely, someplace embedded in that 72nd Psalm is kind of the goal of it all. And the goal of it all is that righteousness and justice result in peace. Same thing we talked about last Sunday. Peace is wholeness. Peace is shalom. Peace, as in the words of Paul, no more division, but that we are all one in the name of Christ. So I invite you this year to join me in that project of being those who are instrumental in helping the justice roll down like waters, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, that you partner with me in being those who bring light to the darkness, who in the midst of a world that doesn't seem like it's changed very much for the last thousands of years, suddenly here's a church that has a faith to say, this place we live in called planet Earth can change. We can change. We can take seriously that there will come a day when there are no more on the outside looking in. There are no more have-nots when we have. But that together we are one with one Lord and one faith and one God of us all. Amen.